Okay, good morning, everyone. So this is Introduction to Literature, and this is our second class. Before we start, I know that it is hard for us to meet in a synchronous way, meaning that we cannot meet, uh, on Zoom live, and that's why I try to record this class and put it on YouTube, so you can watch it at any time you want, and you can pause whatever you want to do. That's a recorded class, which I think is better than meeting in on Zoom. Okay, so today will be very short class. We will talk about fiction. If you remember in the previous class, we divided literature into three kinds, right? So we divided literature into poetry, drama, and fiction. Today we will talk in detail about fiction and how fiction is divided into sub-genres or kinds. Genre means kind. Okay, so let's get started. Now I'm gonna share a screen here and I will highlight some stuff for you so that you can look closely at what I'm explaining. By the way, now for the PDF that I put on e-learning, it was from page 6 to 9 and from page 29 to page 31. So I skipped page 6 to 9 because this, I feel like page 6 to 9 is, these pages are about just how to read literature and how you analyze literature. I don't think this is, relevant to our course. So I moved to page 29, and here we can discuss fiction. Okay. Now, key concepts. I will read and I'll explain everything in detail. As you read, respond to, and write about fiction, some key terms and concepts may be useful in comparing and distinguishing different kinds of stories. Stories may be oral rather than written down, and they may be of different length. They may be based on true stories or completely invented. They may be written in verse rather than prose, or they may be created in media other than the printed page. So simply this paragraph talks about how fiction, is not connected only to literature. Fiction can be found in different ways and in different, outlets. And also fiction can be oral, meaning that, someone tell you a story, okay? That is called, oral literature. And it can be also written literature. So it can be oral and written. Okay, so story or narrative. Now, what is the difference between story or narrative? Let's look at the description here and we will comment on this. Generally speaking, a story is a short account of an incident or a series of incidents, whether actual or invented. The word is often used to refer to an entertaining tale of imaginary people and events. But it is also used in phrases like the story of my life, suggesting a true account. Okay, so that's the first part, which is the story. The story, it can be either a true story or it can be a fictional story, something that is invented or imaginative. But also you can say, I'm gonna tell you about my story or the story of my life. So this is a real story that happens to you. Okay, now in contrast, the narrative here, the term narrative is especially useful as a general concept for the substance rather than the form of what is told about persons and their actions. Okay, so a story or tale is usually short, whereas a narrative may be of any length from a sentence to a series of novels and beyond. So simply a story, I think the story is more of a personal thing, that you tell your story, okay? That's the story. And sometimes the story is the short summary of something. That's called the story. But when we talk about narrative, here we talk about the art of writing the story, the content of it, what we have in this work, and that's why we call it a narrative. So that's the difference between story and a narrative. Now these things, I don't think you need to know them. Just read them, okay? Just read these. Let me choose highlight. Just read these. Just you don't need to memorize them or know them, just for your knowledge. Okay, now here is what is important here. Oral narrative and tales. What is the difference between oral narrative and tales? We tend to think of stories in their written form, but many of the stories that we now regard as among the world's most greatest, such as Homer's The Iliad and the Old English epic Beowulf, were sung or recited by generations of storytellers before being written down. Okay, so here what's going on here is that oral narrative, okay, means that stories that are recited or that are said orally, not written, okay? So that's what we mean by oral narrative. And examples of oral narratives is the English epic Beowulf, and we have also Homer's The Iliad. These are some of the examples of oral narrative. Just as rumors change shape as they circulate, oral stories tend to be more fluid than printed stories. Traditionally, oral tales such as fairy tales or folk tales may endure for a very long time, yet take different forms in um, various countries and eras, and it is often difficult or impossible to trace such a story back to a single author or a creator. So what does that mean is that, you know, we have oral stories that that can be passed on from one generation to the next, okay? Like, for example, my father tells me a story, and then my father got this story from his grandfather, and his grandfather, he got it from his or great grandfather, and then, you know, his great grandfather got it from his great great grandfather, etc. So we have this chain where the story moves from one generation to the next, okay? And in every generation and every move for this story, we have some kind of change and modifications. And most importantly, these stories are you know, are modified, okay? And you cannot locate the originator or the author or the creator of these stories. That's why, because they are oral stories, they are passed down from one generation to the next. And in a sense, then, an oral story is the creation of a whole community, just as oral storytelling tend to be more communal than reading. Okay, so that's the difference, you know, that's what we mean by oral stories, is that it has to do with the community, okay? And I'm sure that every one of you, you know, have some oral stories told by your mother or your father or your uncle or even your grandfather or mother. Okay, certain recognizable signals set a story or a tale apart from common speech and encourages us to pay a different kind of attention. Children know that a story is beginning with when they hear or read Once Upon a Time. And traditional oral storytellers have formal ways to set up a tale, such as Sumam Tui, listen to me, as Spokane storyteller says, and they lived happily after, even after, or simply the end, may similarly indicate when the story is over. Such conventions have been updated since the invention of printing and the spread of literacy. So here, this paragraph distinguishes between the printed story and the oral stories. So the oral stories, you know, there are conventions that we have to know. For example, the beginning of the story, when we hear the word once upon a time, we know that this is the beginning of a story that children will pay attention to, okay? And then we have how the story, you know, ends, for example, the end or the happy ending. These are some of the conventions of oral stories. But when story or stories, you know, got printed, you know, we have different, you know, kinds and different conventions for this. And I think what we're gonna explore now is the printed story compared to the oral stories, okay? Now we have first fiction and nonfiction. Now, before we start talking about fiction and nonfiction, you know, we have to distinguish between these two terms. Now, fiction, it means creative, imaginative, something unreal, but that's a general term, you know. Nonfiction means that this is a real thing, that it's maybe a historical thing or something that really happened. But again, you know, there is, you know, a kind of collapse between fiction and nonfiction, because fiction can include history, can include real stories, and nonfiction can also include fictional stories, something that is untrue. So we will talk about this in particular, but generally speaking, fiction has to do with the imaginative or creative, something that is unreal, whereas nonfiction has to do with the real stories. Okay, let me read now. The word fiction comes from the Latin root fingere, to fashion or form. See here that you created, to fashion or form. There is definitions concerning the act of making something artificial to imitate something else. Okay, and here also it talks about the act of making something artificial to imitate something. So simply, when you write fiction, you imitate something. Like, for example, when you write something, you imitate life. You create people, you create a city, you create nature. Everything is fictional, and you create it as an imitation or an artificial thing for external life. In the past 2 centuries, fiction has become more narrowly defined, and here's the definition of the recent definition of fiction as a prose narrative about the imaginary people and events. I disagree with this term, but anyways, this is good, you know, for you to have concerning what we mean by fiction. It's a prose. Prose is the opposite of verse, okay? Verse is poetry. Prose is you know, this like just the normal writing, the normal writing, not the poetry, or the opposite of poetry or verse is prose. So it's a prose narrative about imaginary people and events, and the main meaning of the word as we use it in this anthology. Okay, so here in this anthology, or in this, you know, introduction, whenever we use the word prose narrative here, we talk about imaginary people or events. All right, so now this is a very short analysis of fiction, prose fiction, and its length, because fiction can be different in terms of length. Here, pay attention to me, because this is very easy, but you have to pay attention to. A novel is a work of prose fiction of about 40,000 words or more. So simply 40,000 words. If you go to a Google document, you will find the word counts at the bottom of the page on the left side, okay? That's called the word count. Now, if the document has more than 40,000 words, it is called a novel, okay? Because it is the biggest type of fiction. The form arose in the 17th century and early 18th century as prose, romance, and adventure. Tales began to adopt literature of the history and the oral and the narrative, the travel narrative, as well as memoirs, letters, and biographies. So this is the definition of the novel. What is the novel? A novel is a prose fiction about 40,000 words or more. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it appeared in the 17th or early 18th century. So before the 17th century, we did not have novel as a genre, because fiction in general, or the novel, was a newly invented genre. It appeared in the 17th century, but in the 16th, 14th, 13th, and back, we don't have a genre called novel. Now, a novella, this is the second one, is a work of prose fiction about 17,000 to 40,000 words. So simply, novella is a shorter form of the novel, okay? Now, the novel is the biggest one. Now, the shorter one is the novella, which is 17,000 to 40,000 words. The novella form was specially favored between about 1850 to 1950s. This is the time when it was favored, you know, the novella, largely because it can be more tightly controlled and concentrated on long novel while focusing on the inner workings of the characters. So simply the novella, you know, appeared in 1850 to 1950 because of its, you know, unique, you know, characteristic. It is here, as mentioned here, it is more tightly controlled, and it concentrates on the topic more than a novel. A novel is 300 or 400 pages, whereas the novella is just 100 pages. So imagine yourself reading 100 page or reading 300 page. Which one do you think that is more controlled, concentrated? And you know, it is easy to finish, to be honest with you. I would prefer reading a novella than reading a novel, because I get bored fast. Now, the third one is a short story, okay? Now, what is a short story? Again, a short story is a prose fiction, okay? Broadly defined as anywhere between 1,000 and 20,000 words. So if you have a work that is between 1,000 to 20,000 words, this is called the short story. One exception of short story is that it may be read in a single setting. Okay, now, if you read a novella or a novel, you may take 2 or 3 days to finish it. But when you read a short story, you can finish it just in 1 day. I mean, some people finish a novel in 1 day, but it depends. Generally speaking, short story, you can finish it in 1 day. A novella or novel may take 2 or 3 days or more maybe. The modern short story developed in the mid-19th century, in part because of the growing popularity of magazines. And this is very important, because in magazines, you cannot put a story of 40,000 words or 100,000 words. You have something short to include it in a magazine. So in this case, they invented something new, which is the short story, to include it in the magazines in the mid-19th century. And that's why we have the short story. Now, the last type of fiction, which is a short story, sometimes called flash fiction or micro fiction. This is generally not much longer than 1,000 words and sometimes much shorter. There have always been very short fictions, including parables, and these are examples of short fictions, including parables and fables. But the short story is an invention of the recent decades also. So here, examples of short fiction. I just want to show you an example of this because in the book it is mentioned fables. So if you write Aesop's fables, because I want to show you some of his fables here. Okay. Okay, here you go. Let me share this screen and show you this. Now, this is a very short story. Here, this is Aesop's fables. These are very short stories that talk about a very limited topic. Here, the story is about the frogs and the ox. The frogs and the ox. Okay, so an ox came down to a reedy pool to drink. As he splashed heavily into the water, he crushed a young frog into the mud. The old frog soon missed the little one and asked his brothers and sisters what had become of him. So here we have this frog is missing one of the little frogs because an ox smashed him. And that's very terrible, incident. When the old frog came and counted his, little frogs, he found one frog missing. And then the old frog said, "A great big monster," said one of them, "stepped onto little brother with one of his huge feet." So this is one of the small frogs said that. "Big was he?" said the old frog, buffing herself up. "Was he as big as this?" "Oh, much bigger," they cried. The frog buffed up still more. "He could not have been bigger than this," he said. But the little frogs all declared that the monster was much, much bigger, and the old frog kept puffing herself out more and more until all at once she burst. Don't attempt the impossible. So simply, this story is telling us about how the old frog tried to do something impossible by showing how big he is, okay? So she pumped air inside her body and she becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, but she could not be as big as an ox. Ox means in Arabic is, Thor, so it cannot be, the frog cannot be like an ox. And that's why in the end, this frog exploded and died, okay? And this is, an example of how you as people should not do something impossible, because this will lead to your death or to your end. Now, what is important about this story is that it is very short. We end it just in 1 or 2 minutes, okay? That's the shortest short story that we will come across. Okay, so let's go back to our PDF here. No, not here, it's here, okay. Oh, no, yeah, I think it's this one. Is it? No, no, not this one. I think. Okay, okay, where is that? Okay, I think here. But we have to go to another here. Yeah, so now we will continue discussing here the last thing. In contrast with fiction, nonfiction here again, well, we talked about the novel, the novella, the short story, and the very short story. These are fictional work. Now we have nonfiction. Usually it refers to, okay, so just okay, so the last thing that we are going to talk about is nonfiction. Now, nonfiction usually refers to the factual, the real prose narrative. Some major nonfiction genres are history, biography, autobiographies. These are examples of nonfiction. In film, documentaries and biotopics or biographical feature films similarly um, attempt to represent real people, places, and events. The boundaries between fiction and nonfiction is often blurred today. So here, what it means, it will explain now. As it was centuries ago, so-called true crime novels such as Truman Capote's In Cold Blood and the novelized biographies such as Calm Tobin the Masters about the life of the novelist Henry James used the techniques of fiction writing to narrate events. The graphic novels here with former derived from comic books and have become increasingly popular medium for memoir. Some Hollywood movies and TVs show dramatize real people in everyday situation or context or real events such as assassination of President John Kennedy. In contrast, historical fiction developed by Sir Walter Scott around 1815 comprises prose narrative that represent history in imaginative way. In such works of prose fiction adhere closely to the fact that of history and actual lives, as many true life stories are more or less fictionalized. So here what's going on here is that generally speaking, fiction is something imaginative, nonfiction something factual or real. But sometimes this definition or this division can be blurred. So sometimes we have fiction that use real events in real life. For example, historical fiction. Historical fictions talk about history, but in a fictional way. So we have real figure, but we have fictional events. So again, now fictional novels are not, can be both fictional and non-fictional. Graphic novels, for example, are derived from comic books, okay, as you can see here. So graphic novels, they are fictional, but they are driven from comic books, which are non-fictional or factual books. So simply here, there is, generally speaking, we have a difference between fiction and non-fiction. Fiction is non-factual, imaginative, creative. Nonfiction is factual, real, and it talks about real events. But sometimes this division or this, distinction can be collapsed and can be, and we have a work that can be both fiction and nonfiction at the same time. Okay, so fiction chapters in this volume present a collect of prose works. Okay, so this is like, the end of the presentation. I don't think you need this writing about fiction. You can read it by yourself. That's all for today's class. Thank you very much, guys, for watching. And I hope that this will be very helpful. Just to conclude, at the beginning, we talked about oral literature and how oral literature means that literature that is orally transmitted or passed on from one generation to the next. And because of that, we have a kind of modification and transformation to this kind of literature. And also concerning oral literature, it is a communal or community literature because there is no a specific author or creator, and it moves from generation, a whole group, to another generation. And also we talk about the difference between a story and a narrative. We said that a story is something that has to do with the person, like you tell your own personal story. But a narrative has to be, something that is more of a technical term, and it has to do with literature more. So in literature, we use more of a narrative rather than a story. And sometimes narrative is very big. It may represent a novel. And we said that the novel is more than 40,000 words. Okay, and then we go back to the difference between fiction and nonfiction, and we talked about how fiction is divided into 4 parts: novel, novella, short story, and short stories. These are the different kinds of fiction. And then we talked about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, and we said that fiction is something that is imaginative and creative, whereas nonfiction is something that is factual and real. This is all about it today. Inshallah, I will send you, we will discuss one of the short stories next time. And after this short story, we will take our formal quiz for this class. So remember, next time we will take a short story, and then we will take our first quiz. Thank you very much, guys, for watching. And please go to YouTube, and I would like you all to comment on the videos, positively, negatively, whatever you want. And also, if you have any question, please ask me over there. Okay, thank you very much, guys, and see you next time.